with a map and a plan. No place too tiny for this determined man. Crossing the counties one by one, he'll see in every English corner a bit of history.
The South Kesteven series is sponsored by Gainsborough Cycles 01427 617 752. For all your cycling needs, this is your one-stop shop located at 20 Ropery Road, Gainsborough, or online at gainsboroughcycles.com. There's a link in the description. Gainsborough Cycles, ask for Trevor Halstead. Hello folks, welcome back to South Kesteven for another run this week. Now, how about this? We are definitely in the depths of winter now, and as if you needed proof, the road behind me has a covering of snow. It's only a little dusting though, and it shouldn't be anything too difficult for me to deal with, hopefully. So where are we? Well, this road runs through a very simple village which is dominated by a big house. Welcome to Stoke Rochford. Stoke Rochford, outlying farm belonging to the Rochford family. Right, South Kesteveners, strap in because there are 49 to go here, and all of them will make an appearance on TVI before this year is out. We have 2 runs of 5 first of all, one this week and one next. Starting us off, we have a place we've mentioned loads of times before. This is Stoke Rochford, which is very small. It's basically one road with everything on it, except for the hall, which lies to the north. It used to have a school and a shop, but they've both closed, leaving behind a village known today for just 2 principal buildings. One is the doubly dedicated Church of St Mary and St Andrew, which ironically isn't actually in Stoke Rochford. That's actually over the border into Easton, but only just. It's seen a few high-profile weddings, that's for sure. The other building everyone knows here is the awesome Stoke Rochford Hall, built in 1845. That's been a whole host of things in its time. It was formerly the NUT's National Training Centre, but at present it's a hotel. This one has had some very well-known faces live within its boundaries. Strongman Jeff Capes was one of them, but he died in 2024. Perhaps overshadowing him somewhat anyway is Lady Sarah McCorkadale, an older sister of Diana, Princess of Wales. Let's see her village. To understand Stoke Rochford, you have to first understand the fact there were once 2 villages and 2 parishes here. They were called North Stoke and South Stoke. North Stoke was removed in 1843 when the grounds of Stoke Rochford Hall were expanded. On this old map you can see South Stoke. In effect, that's the village that's been left behind, the one that we will be walking through today. The parish of North Stoke still existed at this time, but most of it was covered by parkland. North Stoke has since been done away with. At the same time, South Stoke saw a lot of changes too. It wasn't removed like its northern neighbour, instead it was redesigned and laid out in accordance with the parkland, complementing its architectural scheme. Well, isn't it amazing what money can do? And so the village as you see it here was what it would look like some 55 years after the hall was built by William Byrne. It's been pretty much the same ever since, although some of its features have been lost since these days. Let's have a look at what it contained. South Stoke stands at the foot of the long entrance drive up to the hall. It's linear, but there is a sort of clustered appearance to it because the road that it's all laid upon has 2 rather big bends in it. On one of the bends is the church with a double dedication to St Mary and St Andrew. Just up the road there was a school, and both that and the church are still standing today, even though the school isn't teaching any children now. Aside from that, South Stoke was all residences. It was made up of cottages that housed workers that served the estate. We often find with estate villages that they end up as a mere shell of their former selves, but funnily enough, South Stoke has actually gained some facilities since these times. This was well before it acquired its shop and its village hall at either end of the road through it. The biggest change to the village now would be the fact that nobody calls it South Stoke anymore. It's now referred to on maps and even on road signs as Stoke Rochford. In a way, that's wrong in and of itself, but by extension, it also doesn't recognise the once existence of North Stoke. South Stoke's only physical changes have come in the form of the additional buildings we've just mentioned, the shop and the village hall. They are going to be very important to us here because they'll define how we walk through it. We'll start at the village hall and work our way east, passing the school before entering the churchyard. You can actually walk through the churchyard fully and back to the road. That's thanks to a path that crosses a stream called the Kringle Brook via a bridge. The path emerges at the shop, where we'll turn around and use the road to form a loop back to the start. In doing so, we'll pass the entrance to Stoke Rochford Hall. Even though it's surrounded by dense woodland, we can actually see the hall here perfectly legally, and this is why. The hall is a hotel, so it gets regular visitors as it is, but its entrance drive is a public bridleway, so walking it is totally legal anyway. We won't go too far though, just far enough to see the hall and Newton's obelisk, which is a well-known structure in its car park. Let's get started with the village hall. Importantly, this village hall does not just serve Stoke Rochford. This is also the main communal venue for the village of Easton on the other side of the A1. The two parishes share a common council, which often meets here. The building is very well used and benefits from a large bright hall and meeting room. It's also a large building, and that gives it the potential to run a variety of events. Neither Easton nor Stoke Rochford are massive villages, but together, I bet they could still fill this easily. Not far up the road towards the church, we have an old water pump. Not a lot is known about this one, but it's definitely mid-19th century and Grade 2 listed. It was likely built when South Stoke's layout was reconfigured as part of the extensions to Stoke Rochford Hall's parkland. Virtually next door to the pump we have the old village school. More accurately, this is an old school and a school house. Grade 2 listed, it was built in 1840 by William Byrne, the same guy responsible for the rebuilding of Stoke Rochford Hall 3 years later. Stoke Rochford hasn't had a primary school for a number of years now. Local children have to attend other schools such as the one at Colsterworth or the one at Harloxton, for example. However, the village's association with education is huge, as we'll learn in a bit. Stoke Rochford is an estate village, of that there can be no question. A lot of the houses it possesses were tied to the hall, and it was full of estate workers at one time. It's hard to not describe this place as high class, especially when you consider some of the people who've lived here. This is Lady Sarah McCorquodale, a resident of Stoke Rochford, born on the 19th of March 1955 at Sandringham. Lady Sarah is one of the two older sisters of Diana, Princess of Wales, the other being Lady Jane Fellows. For a short period of time, our current king, Charles III, was her partner. It was down to her that Charles and Diana ended up together. It was thanks to Lady Sarah that the pair were introduced in 1977. Of course, her royal connections are still a thing. Lady Sarah is the aunt of HRH Prince William, the current Prince of Wales, and Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex. Her birth name was Elizabeth Sarah Lavinia Spencer. In 1975, when her grandfather died and her father became the 8th Earl Spencer, the lady title was given to her as a courtesy. For 1 year, Lady Sarah was the High Sheriff of Lincolnshire. Lady Sarah was also Master of the Beaver Hunt in 2010 and the President of the Diana Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, which raised over £112 million for various charities before closing in 2012. Lady Sarah later commented on her sister's marriage, saying, "I introduced them, I'm Cupid." Some have stated the relationship between her and Diana was often strained because of her long resentment of the prince marrying Diana and not her, though others, including Diana's biographer Andrew Morton, have said Lady Sarah was one of the few people Diana trusted. Righty, okay, so now we know a bit about who lives here. Let's have a look at one of the main features here of Stoke Rochford. We're about to enter the churchyard, and as you can see, this is dedicated to St Andrew and St Mary. But look underneath, this is the more interesting bit. North and South Stoke with Easton. And that is really one of the only things you'll find here which references North Stoke, which is obviously gone now. Let's see exactly why it's referenced at the church. So now we come to the church, which is dedicated to St Mary and St Andrew. Why does this have a double dedication, you ask? Well, we already know the answer, partially. It's all to do with when North Stoke was essentially wiped off the map. North Stoke survived until the 19th century when it was cleared for the extension of the park surrounding Stoke Rochford Hall. That process removed not only its remaining dwellings, but also its church, and so this one was rededicated. Now, this one is dedicated to both saints that gave their names to the two former churches of both North and South Stoke. In addition, the remains of a Saxon cross from the old church at North Stoke, discovered after its demolition, can now be found here. The Domesday Book tells us there were no complete churches in either village when it was compiled. The deserted medieval village of Ganthorpe, which now lies within the grounds of the hall, also had a chapel. Physical evidence suggests it may have had an 11th century origin. The oldest parts of this church are the nave, which is essentially Norman, and the tower's hood mould. Chancel chapels were added in the 15th century, the south in 1448 by Ralph Rochford, and the north between 1460 and 1470 by Henry Rochford, Ralph's brother. The North Chapel and the North Aisle have since been used to commemorate the Turner family of Stoke Rochford Hall. More on them in a bit. The South Chapel and South Aisle have become associated with the Cholmondeley family of Easton Hall to the south. That connection is a handy segue here into the fact that this church is not in Stoke Rochford. The craziness of the boundaries here means that this is actually within Easton. The boundaries between the parishes run around it, but of course it makes way more sense in this episode. The church has a couple of wartime connections. The clock on the tower was erected in 1920 as a World War I memorial. During World War II, Operation Market Garden was planned at Stoke Rochford Hall, and a commemoration service for the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment is held here every year. In 2012, Emily McCorquodale, the daughter of Lady Sarah and the niece of the late Princess of Wales, married director James Hutt in this church. Attending the ceremony were the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, Prince Harry and Earl Spencer. You can walk through the churchyard here thanks to a footpath that runs back to the road. By doing this, you'll pass over a small stream called the Kringle Brook, using a footbridge. See you back on dry land in a few moments.
Don't ever let anybody tell you that Lincolnshire is completely flat. This is proof it's not, because coming up from the back, it's quite a steep hill. I'll tell you what, the view's pretty good. There you go. You can see the stream and the bridge we've just come across and the church away in the distance. Stoke Rochford Hall is over there through them gates. We're about to come to that. Before we do though, we've got the small matter of this house to talk about.
The path has brought us to this house, which has had a few extensions in its time, as you can probably see. A lot of those extensions have come along in the last few years. The oldest part of this house used to be Stoke Rochford's village shop. It was also the post office, but you'd likely never know that now because there's nothing to suggest this was ever either. Google Street View from 2009 though is your proof. Go there and you'll see what this used to look like. Until recently, it still had its postbox by the roadside. Stoke Rochford Hall was designed by the architect William Byrne and it was built between 1843 and 1845. It was gutted by a fire in 2005, but it's still a magnificent building. As country residences go, this one's had more than its fair share of other uses. It was formerly the NUT's National Training Centre, and as well as a hotel and a venue for conferences and wedding receptions, a venture which it continues in to this day by the way, the hall in 2009 was named the best country retreat in the UK by Les Routiers. Stoke Rochford Hall, as we know it now, is the latest in a long line of residences to have occupied this site. The Romans knew this place for a start. The remains of a villa and a bathhouse were identified here by William Stukely in 1739. No substantive ruins are preserved now though. The Neville family had a house here in the 14th century, and the estate it was tied to passed to the Rochfords in the 15th century. That's how Stoke Rochford gets its name. The Coneys were next to come along in the 16th century, and then the Turners arrived. The estate was purchased by Sir Edmund Turner around the time he was knighted in 1663. He began building a grand house here in 1665, but that was demolished in 1774. In 1794, the Turners built a smaller house to replace it, and in turn, that was replaced by the current hall. The present building, dating from 1843, was built for Christopher Turner. For the rest of the 19th century and the early 20th, it remained Turner-owned, until it was requisitioned by the War Office in 1940. 5 years later, a Canadian Lancaster bomber crashed in its grounds. After the war, Kesteven County Council purchased it, and in 1948 this became the Kesteven College of Education, a teacher training establishment. That closed in 1978, allowing the NUT to convert it into a training and conference centre. It wasn't solely used by the NUT though. Other national organisations and companies took advantage of its handy situation close to the A1 and Grantham railway station. It was, for example, in 1979, the venue for a public inquiry into mining in the Vale of Belvoir. In 2005, a fire gutted the interior, but it was later restored by English Heritage at a cost of £12 million. The hall is now a hotel, and it has banqueting facilities, a sports club and a restaurant. It's often used for wedding receptions and for parties. Part of the grounds are used as a golf course too, but golf is something Stoke Rochford Hall has had since the Turners were around. The course was laid out in 1924 by Christopher Turner, and Stoke Rochford Golf Club is still using that same course to this day. The hall is undoubtedly a very important building, but walk or drive up to it and you can't miss this thing. This is Newton's obelisk. This is Turner related. It's been here since 1847 when Charles Turner, a former prebendary of Lincoln Cathedral, was in residence. Charles Turner was an antiquarian and a patron of science. It was his latter persuasion that explains this. He added to the ornaments already in the park by erecting this obelisk in memory of Sir Isaac Newton, born as we know just up the road in Woolsthorpe. Like the hall, the monument was the work of William Byrne. The turner certainly kept him busy. The obelisk was announced to the world in the pages of an Astronomical Society report in early 1848, which was duly picked up by the press and circulated to the masses. Now, before we can wrap this one up, we have to mention the two tunnels that Stoke Rochford is known for. They both carried railways. Stoke Tunnel, the more conventional of the two, is located on the East Coast Main Line, which passes through part of the parish to the east. The tunnel runs through the highest point of the line between London King's Cross and Berwick-upon-Tweed on an inclined stretch known as the Stoke Bank. It's approximately 880 yards or 800 metres long and extends into Easton. Due to the bottleneck the tunnel presents, managing train movements through this section is a critical task for local signal operators. You see, the line is quadruple track mostly, but through the tunnel it's only double track. Not that you'd know when you're on a train. Now, the other tunnel in Stoke Rochford was at the Hall. It was called the Coal Tunnel, and it carried its own unique, private narrow gauge railway around the cellars. This internal railway was historically used to transport coal to the principal rooms and service areas of the Hall. The narrow gauge rails and a turntable from this system still survive to this very day, but it's been several decades since it carried coal. Coal dust found in the service shafts confirms it was in use for some time, although the exact duration is unknown. It never fails to amaze me just how much can be done when you have a lot of money. The Turners were clearly very wealthy and could afford to build this grand house. Stoke Rochford is not alone when it comes to those in South Kesteven. Tomorrow there's a similar village to see that used to have a hall. Hello folks, welcome back to South Kesteven once again. Now behind me at the beginning of this episode you can see we've got an entranceway. If you go through there you enter a huge walled garden, and it's an attraction which brings people to this little village all year round. Those are the Eastern walled gardens, and you can find them in the parish of Easton. Easton, East Farm. Remember yesterday we mentioned right at the very end of the Stoke Rochford episode that it certainly wasn't alone when it came to being an estate village in these parts. Well, today we have proof of that. Welcome to Easton, which commanded its own. Easton is a tiny village, very similar in size to Stoke Rochford. The two actually share the same council despite being on opposite sides of the A1. The two are inseparable. Easton's church, as we learned yesterday, is actually St Mary and St Andrews in what used to be South Stoke. This is a village that's still practically the same size as it was back in the times of Doomsday. It only has a handful of houses, but the ones that are here were all linked in some way to Easton Hall. That was a massive house which had to be pulled down after World War II owing to some army damage. The remains of the hall are now limited to just the entrance hall and the former gardens, but the latter has been turned into something spectacular. Easton might not be the best known of places in Lincolnshire, but those gardens help to put it on the map nowadays. Every year, upwards of 20,000 people come to Easton to enjoy the walled gardens, the result of a project that was started by the Cholmondeley family who've been in the village for generations. In addition, Easton is also well known to local lorry drivers. Let's go and see why, shall we? This is what the tiny village of Easton looked like on maps in 1900. There hasn't ever been a lot to this one, even from the time of Doomsday. Easton is around 2 miles north of Colsterworth and 1 mile east of the A1, shown on these maps of course as the Great North Road. The village has never had a church. Instead, it's always had a connection with Stoke Rochford on the other side of that road. It still today forms part of the North and South Stoke with Easton Church Parish, which contains the Church of St Andrew and St Mary at Stoke Rochford. Funnily enough though, the two villages have never been physically connected by road, as far as I can tell anyway. When the Great North Road became the A1, it was straightened and converted into a dual carriageway in 1960, but Easton was already on a dead end. That said, there is a footpath that runs through the parkland to the north between the villages that could maybe once have been a road joining them together. One thing's for sure though, Easton and Stoke Rochford have been on opposite sides of a major road for a long time. So perhaps given that setup, you'd want to assume Easton had nothing really to attract people. Well, in these times that was perhaps very true. You see, Easton, since the 15th century at least, wasn't much more than just the principal residence of a wealthy family, the Cholmondeleys. Sure, it grew a little since those times, but here you can see the village was still relatively small, dominated by the parkland surrounding the Cholmondeleys' manor house. That was Easton Hall, or Easton House, as it was referred to here. There were late Victorian additions, like the schoolhouse, but this is really all Easton was for centuries. A big house with parkland around it, and a series of houses for the workers of the estate. It was all to change after World War II. To the untrained eye, Easton looks virtually the same today, but there's one major difference. The hall has gone. Pulled down after it was damaged during the war, now the site of the hall is marked only by two things: the former entrance hall and the gardens. The cottages for its workers have in some cases become holiday lets, but the layout of the village has never altered. Easton still remains on its dead end between the A1 and the B6403, which by the way follows the route of the Roman High Dyke at this point. Today's walk won't really be a walk. There's no point in trying to walk this one because everything is clustered around one area, the entrance to the former hall. So for the most part we'll drive through this, stopping at various points, like the old schoolhouse for example. To finish with, we'll hop over High Dyke to get to the Easton Cold Store. That's a massive modern building that puts the size of the estate to shame these days. It's also why lorries can often be seen toing and froing to the A1 around here. Let's get into it, folks. This is the centre of Easton, and it's marked by this cross at the point where the road leading to the village comes to an abrupt stop. Easton has, for a long time, been laid out in this way. When the A1 was the Great North Road, it was separated from the village by some parkland. So what's this cross all about then? Well, nobody is totally sure actually. We know it's not a war memorial because it was built in 1840, long before either of the two world wars came about. It seems to have been simply just an entrance marker to the Easton estate. You see, like Stoke Rochford, Easton is an estate village, and at the centre of that estate there used to be a principal dwelling. In 1592, Sir Henry Cholmondeley bought the manor of Easton, and it was his direct descendant, Sir Montague Cholmondeley, who rebuilt the village in the early 19th century. As part of that rebuild, Easton Hall, or Easton House if you will, which was created by Sir Henry Cholmondeley originally, was partly reconstructed in 1805, and then later enlarged. The big difference between it and the huge hall at Stoke Rochford is that here there is no longer a house. Easton Hall was damaged while being used by the army during World War II, and it was that damage that led to it being eventually pulled down in 1951. There are remains though, the entrance hall being one of them. The 12-acre garden remained too, but for a long time it was totally abandoned. Today though, it's the garden that attracts people to Easton. There was a major renovation project in 2001, directed by the Cholmondeley family, who still live in the village. The result is the Easton Walled Garden, which as of 2024 attracts 20,000 visitors a year. Once enjoyed exclusively by the Cholmondeley family as their private garden, Easton Walled Gardens now offer the general public a pause from the pace of life. You can saunter through them at your leisure and enjoy what the family used to, exclusively. Nowadays, the estate also has two other visitor attractions, namely the Apple Store Tea Room and the Courtyard, which has shops where you can buy seeds to grow the flowers you can find in the gardens. That means it's possible to take a little bit of Easton home with you. For most of its history, life here revolved around Easton House, a home for generations of the Cholmondeley family. In their original incarnation, the gardens were a series of walled enclosures, which simply framed the family's manor house. As eras passed, the gardens were modified from the overlooked walled gardens for Tudor and Jacobean tastes to a Victorian garden design that created borders, ornamental stonework and glass houses. It was all rather posh though, whichever period you were in. At the beginning of the 20th century, the estate was featured in the pages of Country Life magazine and received a visit from the former US President Franklin D. Roosevelt. His words about Easton still resound today. He described it as a dream of nirvana, almost too good to be true. Easton was much like any other village with normal facilities. It hasn't always been just about the main house and the walled garden. When you drive into and out of it, you'll pass some evidence of that in the form of this old schoolhouse on its edge. Easton is perhaps an unlikely venue for a holiday, but since the gardens have been restored, you can hire some holiday cottages here now. There are some near the gardens, but this old schoolhouse has now been converted into one as well. Should you stay in Easton, you might not realise just how close you are to an ancient site. Not far away from the schoolhouse, in a field, is the site of a former Roman camp. You can't see much of it owing to the presence of hedgerows and trees that get in your way, but it was in this field. We should not be totally surprised about the presence of the Romans here. After all, this camp is a stone's throw away from the line of High Dyke, which we know about from our various travels through North Kesteven. Here in Easton, High Dyke is followed today by the B6403.
Okay, just outside the school here we have a parish notice board. I didn't leave one of these in Stoke Rochford yesterday, but there's one here now, so hopefully people who live in Stoke Rochford, if they come to Easton, they'll see that. Job done.
As you leave Easton to the east, you'll find yourself on the B6403 before long. Close to that, on a minor road leading to Burton Coggles, is a huge industrial building known as the Easton Cold Store. At one time, it was considered to be the largest cold storage facility in Europe. Don't take my word for that, it was none other than Nicholas Pevsner who termed it so before his death in 1983. It must have been notable for him to be interested in it because, as we know, he was more about ancient buildings, like churches. Originally, Easton Cold Store was built for Christian Salverson, but it went on to be a frozen vegetable processing factory for McCain Foods. In front of the vast sheds, there used to be a contrasting polygonal office building with a red pagoda, designed by Rex Critchlow. That's gone now because Easton Cold Store has been rebuilt. Today owned by Magna Vale, the brand new building was designed with no single point of failure, and the massive temperature-controlled facility is like a gigantic freezer, which can hold an impressive 101,000 pallets. The cold store's location is ideal for transport, given we're literally right next to the A1. It's commonplace to see lorries heading to and from the A1 from this place, and normally they're ones belonging to Freshlink. I'm guessing you've all seen those on your travels. Speaking of travelling, it's time I did a bit more. Tomorrow we're off to the north slightly to check out a parish that has 2 main villages and 1 small hamlet. That's nothing out of the ordinary, but the name of one of those villages is sure to get a bit of attention. I mean, it usually does anyway. Welcome back to South Kesteven again, people. Now, you've already clicked on this video, so you know the name of this place. I've got to be very careful in this episode because YouTube are very good at censoring stuff that shall we say, a little bit on the profane side. Well, I can assure you that the name of this place is nothing to do with the meaning that you're thinking it means. It's to do with something else. It's to do with a field, believe it or not. This is Bitchfield and Bassingthorpe. Bitchfield and Bassingthorpe, Bill's open land and Robert de Basewin's outlying village. Well, isn't this one going to be fun? There are many reasons why people come to certain villages across the country. Usually the most popular ones are those which have an actual bona fide attraction, but in this one people come to take a picture with the village sign. Yep, if you don't believe me, all you have to do is type the name Bitchfield into Google and you'll find yourselves looking at loads of people who have taken a snap with the sign. I think, to be honest, I don't really need to explain why, do I? Come on, I think you can work it out. Bitchfield is a very unfortunate name. Really, it should be Billfield, because over time, Bill's open land, or Bill's field as it meant historically, has morphed into Bitchfield. It's certainly one of those place names you would put in the humorous category, now isn't it? Putting all the profane humour aside for a moment, it's actually a pretty interesting place. It's split into 2 pieces, known as Bitchfield and Lower Bitchfield. Lower is arguably the more interesting bit because it has the church dedicated to St Mary Magdalene. As As for Bassingthorpe, that's tiny and often gets overshadowed by its much more infamous neighbour. It has a church too, but otherwise contains just 4 houses. It was merged with Bitchfield in 1931. Let's put them on the map then. Will I be tempted by the sign? Let's see. Bitchfield and Bassingthorpe used to be 2 separate parishes. Bitchfield, which has always been the larger of the 2, is situated on the River West Glen, approximately 3 miles northwest of Corby Glen and 6 miles southeast of Grantham. Its humorous name is a relatively modern thing. It was recorded in the Domesday Book as Bill's Felt, with that deriving from the Old English for Bill's Field. Over time, that morphed into Bitchfield, giving the village its place amongst the funny lists of those village names that exist out there. Historically, the area was agricultural, with 22 households noted across Bitchfield and Bassingthorpe at the time of Domesday. 22 actually placed them among the larger settlements in the region at that time. The 2 villages' proximity to the West Glen has always made them scenic spots for local walks and for cycling, surrounded as they are by rolling farmland typical of the Kesteven area. The 2 are connected by one main road that passes through a third small hamlet called Westby. At the time of these maps, Bitchfield had been recently rebuilt, or at least redesigned. Architectural styles in Bitchfield today are dominated by Lincolnshire limestone, but that's combined with Georgian influences such as symmetrical facades and sash windows from nearby estates. A lot of the properties are barn conversions, and some of them are listed buildings. Bitchfield has never had a great amount of landmarks, and neither has Bassingthorpe really. Here we can see what they did have in 1900, and it's not too dissimilar to what they have today. Bitchfield had 4 main bits of note: the Crown Inn pub on the main street, Bitchfield House just down the road, the Church of St Mary Magdalene in Lower Bitchfield, and the post office not far from it. All 4 of those buildings are still very much standing. Over in Bassingthorpe, you can see it had its own church, a surefire way to know that at one time it commanded its own parish before it was merged with Bitchfield to give us the modern boundaries. Note the manor house and the moated site nearby. Those are still there as well. Virtually nothing has changed since those times. Both Bitchfield and Bassingthorpe, and for that matter Westby between them, have stayed the same. These are definitely villages that have escaped the house builders so far, and still they are very, very rural. So here's the way we'll cover this one. We'll start with Bassingthorpe, which won't take us very long. That's just going to be a case of having a look at the church and the manor house, which are right next to each other. Using the car, we'll then head for Bitchfield. On the way though, we'll make a little detour to Westby in order to put that little hamlet on the map too. Once in Bitchfield, our main walk will see us begin at what used to be the Crown Inn on the main road, through it all. As we discussed a moment ago, Bitchfield is split into 2 pieces, and so from the pub we'll use a footpath over the West Glen River to get ourselves to Lower Bitchfield, where the church is located. We'll then head back via another path in order to complete the circuit. Now, will we see the infamous sign? Let's see. So first up we have the tiny village of Bassingthorpe, located between Bitchfield to the east and Great Ponton to the west. Bassingthorpe is so small it barely registers on any maps. It only has 4 houses, but there are 2 other things that it's known for. Although there is an entry for Bassingthorpe in the Domesday Book, there's no mention of a church in that document. There's definitely one here today, and it's dedicated to St Thomas a Becket. It's a stalwart church, solidly holding its own on this windswept hill. Most of this one is 13th century date-wise, although its large windows are 15th and 16th century additions. The porch is also 16th century. As for the oldest features here, they would be the South Arcade and the Chancel Arch, which are both 12th century. St Thomas's Church used to have something called the Coney Chapel, and that housed several monuments all dedicated to the family of the same name. It was still in being at the end of the 18th century, but now all traces of the chapel have vanished. The other thing Bassingthorpe has to its name is literally right next to the church. It's the manor house and a moated site, although seeing most of the latter is a little challenging because it's within the grounds of the house and its associated farm buildings. The manor house dates from the Tudor period and it's a Grade 1 listed building. It's a huge country house, but what you see here today has been much reduced in size over time. The original house was built in 1568 either by or for Thomas Coney. It's not clear which is true. I would say it was by him because if you look closely on an exterior wall, there's a carved rabbit which is a rebus of the house builder. Of course, a rabbit is alternatively known as a coney, hence the connection. Above it is a rectangular panel containing Coney's woolmark. Inventories indicate that a substantial house existed here in 1564. Whatever dwelling stood here back then was inherited by Thomas Coney in 1545 from his father, who was a merchant on the Calais staple. His wife, Alice, was the daughter of Thomas Lee, a former Lord Mayor of London. You can tell this is on a hilltop. It's very, very cold up here. But the good thing about it being on a hilltop is that you get a great view. This is literally just outside the door of the church here in Bassingthorpe, and you can see for miles here. You can see the Eastern Cold Store away to the left. Remember we saw that yesterday. Well, now we're going to make our way back down this path towards what's the only other sort of main house in the village over here behind those trees, and then we'll get in the car and we'll drive to Bitchfield via Westby. Now, before we can go to Bitchfield, we need to drive through a small hamlet that's often forgotten about in these parts. Between the two main villages there's a place called Westby. It's actually bigger than Bassingthorpe, so it should be termed a village really, but it has no church. Westby occupies two roads. There's Westby Road, which runs from north to south, and then the main part of the settlement is defined by Village Street. That's a dead end that literally runs for a few hundred metres before terminating at an old rectory. Aside from that, there's very little of note about Westby, if I'm honest. There's a couple of farms and whatnot, but it's otherwise all housing and of only minor interest. So, here's the moment you've been waiting for. Let's get ourselves to Bitchfield. Well folks, the answer is I am tempted by the sign, but the trouble is the sign isn't here. Look at this. It's been nicked. It's been nicked. Look, it's here where it's supposed to be. There's meant to be a sign there saying Bitchfield, and it's the one you'll see in all those photographs online of people who have come here and taken their photo with it. I was hoping to do the same, but it ain't there. Never mind. So what does Bitchfield have? Let's find out. Not a million miles away from the sign is what used to be the Crown Inn on Main Street. This originated in the early 17th century and was altered in the 19th using squared limestone rubble. It used to be a farmhouse and it still retains an old barn attached to it. Of a single story, the barn includes block doorways and a breather opening, which highlight its functional evolution over time. The Crown was listed Grade 2 in 1986 as it preserves an early vernacular pub design. The Crown stopped being a pub some time ago now, and for a while it was left in an almost derelict state. Now though, it's been somewhat revamped and turned into a private dwelling called Crown House, still retaining the pub name from yesteryear. Our next job is to take ourselves to Lower Bitchfield. It's sort of a detached portion that lies away from the main village on a dead-end road. It's actually the oldest part of the village, and the casual sign visitors would likely never know it even exists. Now, to get to it, we have to walk across a field using a footpath that runs parallel to Dark Lane. This path crosses the West Glen River, which you may recall from the Countthorpe and Cretan episode a while back. I'll see you in Lower Bitchfield shortly.
Okay, so the actual sign that we were going for isn't there, as we know, but I found another one. Just as you come into Lower Bitchfield, you can take your pick with either of these. You've got one that says Lower Bitchfield, no through road, and then you've got one that actually says Bitchfield. So if you do want to come here and take a picture with the sign, this is the one to go for. And actually, to be fair, you're probably better off with this one, because as you can see, there's plenty of places to park your car. You can't really park on the road over there. I have, but I found a nice safe spot. But yeah, this is probably better, all things considered. Let's go into Lower Bitchfield and see what it's got.
Upon reaching Lower Bitchfield, one of the first things you come across is the old post office on the corner where the road bends westwards towards the church. There is still a post box here. It's a freestanding one, just around the corner. Now we come to the Church of St Mary Magdalene, which serves as the village's primary ecclesiastical landmark. Like the one in Bassingthorpe, this embodies a rich architectural evolution from the medieval period. The structure originated in the 11th century. It was significantly enlarged during the 12th century, including the addition of the north aisle. The tower dates to the late 13th century and is in the Early English style, featuring lancet windows. Other parts of the church have 14th century elements in the Perpendicular Gothic style. The tower, which is topped by a battlemented parapet and a recess-decorated spire, was partially rebuilt after lightning damage in 1947. The porch, dating to the 14th century, features a gabled design with a ribbed roof and side benches. Internally, notable features include a 16th century octagonal font with carved panels including shields, a 12th century north arcade in the transitional style, and 14th century windows with Y tracery and intersecting forms. As the parish church, this has functioned continuously since the 12th century. Today it holds a Grade 1 listed status awarded to it in 1966 for its special architectural and historical interest, spanning a vast period between the 11th and the 19th centuries. Notable historical associations include burials of local gentry and memorials to others. For example, located in the north aisle here, you'll find a 17th century brass plaque with an engraved coat of arms that commemorates Elizabeth Lack. Now to return to Bitchfield proper, and to do that we're going to use another footpath. We could use Dark Lane, the road that links the two parts of the village together, but I opted for this so that we could cover every last bit of the main street. See you there shortly. Between here and the end, we have to pass Bitchfield House. It's the biggest and easily the most noticeable property here. It's an early 19th century Georgian house with classic Georgian proportions adapted for rural gentry use. It was given its Grade 2 listed status in 1986.
Okay, almost back to the beginning. It's a nice walk that around Bitchfield. It's a bit tough underfoot at times because both of those footpaths aren't paved, but you know, you take the rough with the smooth, don't you? Now, we are nearly finished with this episode, but there's one more thing we do need to cover. We need to get in the car because it's to the south of the main village, and there's a bit of debate as to what this thing actually is. Let's see if we can solve it. We have one thing left to cover, and it's to the south of Bitchfield, literally in a field. Drive down the main road through the village and the chances are you won't even know it's there, but on a small hill off to the left are some earthworks. The locals know them as the camp. Now, ironically, the idea that this was a camp is totally false. The camp title suggests it was maybe of a Roman or perhaps Iron Age origin, but this is far younger than both. Instead, these are the remains of a shrunken medieval village. Whether or not these were part of a much larger Bitchfield from centuries back, or if they were a separate village, is unknown. One thing's for sure though, this is only a patch. The earthworks seem to indicate there was once a much larger village sited here. Fragmentary amorphous earthworks are the only indications of a possible shrinkage. They were mapped by using aerial photographs which identified a series of holloways and several enclosures, along with 3 blocks of ridge and furrow. Exactly what stood here is very much unknown. It's known for sure that Bitchfield was once a much larger village. In the Domesday Book it's known it had a church, but there's nothing to indicate that the present Church of St Mary Magdalene sits on a previous building. So, could it have been here? Right, so with that one behind us, we can move on to the next one here in South Kesteven, which isn't quite as infamous as this. Just to the north of Bitchfield, there's another village beginning with the letter B, and it partially shares its name with a town in Buckinghamshire. I'll see you there. Hello folks, welcome back to South Kesteven again for episode number 4 this week. Now behind me here we have Manor Farm, and things with the word manor in their name are very important in this place. There are 2 buildings which are just down the road from here, and one of them is apparently one of the most important historical manor houses ever built. Let's see if we can go and see it. This is Boothby Pagnell.
Boothby Pagnell, shelter farm belonging to the Pagnell family. We continue through South Kesteven today with the village of Boothby Pagnell. Situated on the edge of something called the Ropsley Triangle and commonly shortened to Boothby, this one has one of the most important manor houses in England. Don't just take my word for that. Several historians have made that claim in reference to the manor house here, which dates from around 1200. It can't be accurately dated further than that, but one thing's for sure, it's very old. It sits within the grounds of a more modern principal residence. The manor house is far from being the only thing that visitors to Boothby should know of. There's a fine church not far away from it for starters, and then there's the old rectory also within shouting distance. If you're of a sciencey persuasion, the rectory will interest you. As we know from the Colsterworth episode, which seems like ages ago now, Sir Isaac Newton's famous tree where the apple fell to the ground under the force of gravity is located within the grounds of Woolsthorpe Manor, but some believe that idea to be false. There's a school of thought that says Newton's tree was actually here in Boothby Pagnell because it's known for sure he spent time at Babington's rectory in the mid-1600s. For sure, it was certainly here where he developed a form of calculus. Let's learn more. Boothby Pagnell is located some 6 miles away from Grantham on the B1176. The village was mentioned in the Domesday Book, so it's certainly been here a long old while. At that time it had a population of only 19 people, but that was substantial enough back then. It's never grown massively in the 1,000 years since. Sure, it's gained a few bits here and there, but what village hasn't? That said, it was almost extinct at one point. The village saw a medieval housing decline, possibly after the Black Death, but it did recover. In 1900, the parish looked like this. It was fairly standard for a village at this time. Today, it could still be described as sleepy. It's mostly residential, and being on a fairly minor road away from things like the A1 helps it to be tranquil too. So what have we got to look at in this one then? Well, it's small and there isn't much, but hidden within some of these landmarks are some tales and theories that will certainly interest you. Perhaps none more so than the ones we'll discuss at the manor house. Located to the south of the village, this map shows 2 buildings called Boothby Hall. The larger one to the right is the more modern version of the older one to the left. They both sit within the same private complex, with one far more interesting than the other. Then to the east you can see St Andrew's Church, which hasn't moved since at least the 12th century. There we'll tell a story related to rotten eggs and tomatoes. Shown nearby is the rectory. That's actually a 19th century rebuild, but the rectory here has played a key role in Boothby's past. At this time it also had a school on a small lane that ran westwards from the main street. Now, I had no idea if that was still standing before I got here, but there is of course only one way to find something like that out. Boothby Pagnell certainly hasn't changed its layout drastically since those times, but it does have a few more houses now, as you can see. The main bits are all still as you were. Route-wise, it's not a circle this one, but it's easy enough. We'll basically walk this street by street, starting on Ponton Road, passing the manor houses, plural, and the village hall, which has been built since. Then, on Main Street, we'll tackle the church and the rectory and explain the latter's connection to Sir Isaac Newton. Lastly, there's School Lane, where we'll find out if that old school still stands. With no way back to Ponton Road, we'll turn around at that point and walk back to where we began. It's a simple little village all in all, but it's loaded with history. Let's discover it all. So, Boothby Pagnell, as we've just seen, is little more than 3 streets. You have the main road going from north to south, a small lane off that has the school on it, and then there's an east to west road running along the southern edge of the village. That's where we are, right here. Now, for the most part, this road is all houses, and that's certainly the case on the northern side of it. Starting at Manor Farm in the extreme west, it's an almost unbroken row of dwellings all the way to the junction with Main Street, punctuated only by the village hall. On the southern side, though, it's a different ballgame. A lot of that is open and green because it's part of the parkland connected to Boothby Hall. Before long, the greenery stops, replaced with a drive leading to the house, and then there's a high wall, shielding it from view. There are actually two manor houses here, and they sit within the same massive grounds. Both certainly have some importance, but it's the older of the two that people rave about. We can't see either of them because it's all private property, but I do have some pictures. Impressive as the more recent version is, the 12th century manor house which sits in its grounds has been called by many historians the most important small Norman manor house in England. It can't be accurately dated, but it was built sometime around the year 1200. The house has been altered and added to multiple times over the years and now boasts a 15th century window in the east wall. Parts of the west wing date from an 18th century rebuilding. What we see today is only one part of what was once a much larger building. The house that survives is in a remarkably well-kept condition, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Missing are the former kitchens and the privies, which would have played a huge role in its medieval days. There are also no stables or lodges now either. The whole thing would have been once surrounded by a moat, and parts of that still survive to both the south and the west of the building, although their lines have now been softened somewhat by landscaping. It's a very different setup to what would have been here in 1200. Perhaps the most famous native of Boothby Pagnell, and he lived in this house, was John de Bothby, who took his name from this very village. Bothby was born in the early 14th century and rose to become the Lord Chancellor of Ireland. Of course, also living here for a time were the Pagnells, the family from which Boothby Pagnell gets the last part of its name. They were the lords of Newport Pagnell in Buckinghamshire, but Boothby didn't fall into their hands until the 14th century, by way of marriage. A word for the modern manor house here maybe, and perhaps to avoid a bit of confusion, everyone knows this better as Boothby Hall. A small country house, this was built in 1630 for Thomas Harrington, although it was largely rebuilt in 1824. In those times, it was lived in by a J. Litchford, and the architect for the newer version was one Lewis Verlamy. Both versions served to replace the original Norman manor house in the grounds, but one has to wonder why their predecessor was never demolished. Oh well, I guess we can be thankful. So we've seen a couple of pictures of the manor house there. Now you can actually see the manor house from the road if you stand at the entrance gate here. It's not very clear because there are trees and things in the way, but it's sort of there. There's a footpath that runs across the field over to the right hand side, and I imagine you can see it from there as well, but that's not really helpful to our route because next we're heading this way towards the church. Now, here's a building that Boothby Pagnell has gained since the turn of the 20th century. Boothby is fortunate enough to have an excellent village hall, which was opened in May 1991. This provides an attractive venue for meetings or private parties. It can hold 60 people when it's full. It should also be noted that this is not just a village hall. It doubles as a social club, and that's important given there's no pub in Boothby. As far as I can tell, the village has never had one of those actually. The comfortable club room offers bar facilities at certain times. So next we have the church. Dedicated to St Andrew, this was built in the 12th century, although the Domesday Book does mention a church back in those days. It's pretty safe to assume that whatever building that was stood here, but it's not known for sure. St Andrews was renovated in the late Victorian period, although the process did retain its Norman tower and font, whilst much of the nave still dates to the period between 1125 and 1150. The remodelling in the 1890s was done in a high Anglican style. That was on the wishes of its patroness, Mrs Thorold, whose religious sympathies were not universally accepted. In 1900, that led to a group of Low Church sympathisers called Kensites organising a cycle trip from Grantham with the aim of smashing the sanctuary lamps. There was something of a small riot when they got here. The locals defended their church with overripe tomatoes and rotten eggs, and it worked. Their makeshift missiles drove the Kensites away. Now, when was the last time you heard of a church being defended like that? Though the affair sounds almost humorous today, there was a serious edge to those events. The locals were able to seize a revolver from those Low Church sympathisers, which was then handed over to the police. Okay, and now the church is mighty fine and all that, but so too is the rectory next door, and that has a very, very interesting story to tell us. Almost next door to the church is the old rectory. It's 19th century and in its own right it's actually a pretty notable building. But that said, it's only ever been the rectory and nothing more. If you go back to the 17th century, however, Boothby Pagnell's rectory had another edge to it. It's through the rectory that the village has associations with Sir Isaac Newton. Although he spent most of his time at Woolsthorpe, where his famous tree can be found in the grounds of the manor house there, he stayed at the rectory here as well. Although his uncle, William Askew, was the vicar at Burton Coggles during his period of scientific discoveries, Newton chose to spend time here in the company of the Trinity College fellow Humphrey Babington, who was the vicar at the time. This makes sense. Humphrey Babington was the brother of Catherine Babington, who in turn was a friend of Hannah Askew and the wife of William Clark, the owner of the house at which Newton lodged in Grantham whilst he was at school. Now, this is where you have to have an open mind about historical claims. The rectory at Boothby Pagnell in those days had an orchard, and some people reckon that the apple that Newton famously saw fall from the tree was here rather than at Woolsthorpe. There is some validity to this idea because Newton's own memoirs suggest so. When he was at Boothby Pagnell, it's a known fact that he worked on a theory called fluxions that today is known to scientists and mathematicians as differential calculus. It was also at Babington's rectory where he successfully calculated the area under a hyperbola, a method that involves integral calculus. So whether or not you want to believe the apple and the tree idea is up to you, but Boothby Pagnell definitely has some vital Newtonian connections. So we have one thing left to determine. Is that old school still standing? Let's head up School Lane and find out. There's no school in Boothby Pagnell now, it closed a long time ago, and mostly children have to go to Ropsley just up the road. However, the old schoolhouse does still stand here, and this is it, now turned into a private dwelling. School Lane is otherwise a dead end, and there's not a lot of point hanging around here, so let's go back to the start and reflect on what's been an interesting little walk. So from outside Manor Farm to here on School Lane, it's taken me 22 minutes. That shows you just how small Boothby Pagnell is. This field, by the way, it's
It's got some seriously good earthworks in it. Look at these. Aren't these magnificent? Now, we can't cross this field because there's no right of way across it, rather annoyingly. You can see the village hall over there. It would be handy if there was a path across this, but there isn't. So we've got to use the road that we've already used, back past the church and the manor house. But never mind, it's fine. I don't mind taking a few more steps through the village. And a great little village this has been. Hopefully tomorrow's will be just as good. With another South Kesteven parish in the books, we can move on to the last one for this week, although keep in mind there's another run starting on Monday. To finish up this one, we're heading to another tiny village, a nice circular walk sort of job in fact. I'll see you there. Hello folks, welcome back to South Kesteven for the last time this week. You will see a few more South Kesteven episodes next week, but as far as this week goes, this is your lot. Now we have a nice circular route to undertake in this one, and we're going to take in a few historic buildings, including the old manor house, the rectory, the church, and a few other bits and bobs. And towards the end of this episode, we're also going to see something that a few of you out there might be familiar with if you're learning to drive. This is Old Somerby. Old Somerby, village of the summer sailor. We come to the end of another South Kesteven run today with the parish of Old Somerby. This is a simple little village laid out along 3 roads, one which has the church, the rectory, the old school and the manor house, whilst another has the Fox and Hounds pub. There is of course much more to Old Somerby than just those things, even though this is a parish that's predominantly rural and has quite a lot of open farmland. Almost all of the built-up areas here are focused on Old Somerby itself, right in the middle of the parish. There is also a small hamlet known as Cold Harbour, situated about a mile to the northwest of the village, known for a few things in its own right. It used to have a pub which is now a house called Blue Harbour, and these days the hamlet is also known to many learner drivers. Old Somerby nestles in a slight hollow in the landscape. Its 3 roads form 3 sides of a square when seen on a map, with the 4th side being an area that's relatively underdeveloped. It's known as the pastures. In the middle it's agricultural land, crossed by 2 footpaths. The nature and density of this will have you believe it's a little bigger than it actually is, but that's partly down to the stretches of undeveloped road frontages. Even so, there's enough to keep us busy for another episode, so let's go walking and put Old Somerby on the Lincolnshire map. This is what Old Somerby looked like in 1900, more than 1,000 years after it was first founded. Somerby began its life as a colony of the Danes who ruled Lincolnshire after peace was made with King Alfred in 878 AD. With its Saxon beginnings, there's no surprise that the village is listed in the Domesday Book, where the king's tenant-in-chief is given as Walter Danecourt, a man we've met a fair few times before. As to when the prefix Old came about, well, that's a little unclear. At the time of Domesday, this was Summer Ledderby. That's a Danish word which meant village or home of the summer sailor, and probably referred to a Viking invader of some kind. The village initially evolved as 2 separate settlements, namely High Somerby and Low Somerby. High Somerby evolved around the church and as such is the oldest part of the village.
Low Somerby would come along later, growing alongside what is now the Grantham Road, the B1176. Within that area is an old pit and a quarry, the stone from which was used for local building and for road repair. From the 1950s onwards, High and Low Somerby gradually merged together. Opposite the old village school, council houses were built quickly, followed by more along the southern side of School Lane. These were complemented in the late 1960s with another row of private houses to the north. Whilst the two parts of the village have become more united now, the open feel of the settlement is still maintained as a result of many as yet undeveloped areas and frontages, as well as a number of unobstructed views across paddocks and farmland. So here's what the place had in the early 20th century, and a lot of this is still the same today. In High Somerby there was a church, there was the manor house, and there was the rectory. All three of those are still there now. Also still standing is the school, seen here, but that's a house now. Low Somerby was a long way away and still yet to be conjoined to its High counterpart via those council and private houses. It had a quarry on this corner, with a Methodist chapel close by for company. The chapel seen here has now disappeared, replaced with a house that bears the chapel name. You can see there was a pub on the Grantham Road. That's still there today, but this map doesn't show where it used to be. It hasn't always been there, as we'll discover. So how does all of this look today? Well, it's certainly more connected. This map shows just how much development has taken place between the two halves of Old Somerby. Now there are council houses linking the two parts, and it's more of a complete village, rather than being one that's split into two pieces. It certainly helps the walking route today, though. We'll start in High Somerby at the church and walk along School Lane to the site of the old quarry, first of all. Then it's a case of following the Grantham Road southwards to reach the pastures. We have two options at that point as to how to get back to the start. One way is to follow the pastures, but we're going for the other way. That'll see us cross the fields using a right-of-way which runs back towards the church. To finish with, we'll use the car to check out the hamlet of Cold Harbour. Sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? Let's get going. Let's get started in High Somerby, which is the oldest part of the entire village. Our first port of call is the Old Somerby Manor House. This and its adjoining barn originate from the 16th century and are both Grade 2 listed buildings. It's the church next, a couple of steps away. Old Somerby's Church of St Mary Magdalene shares the same dedication as the one we met earlier this week in Bitchfield. This church has origins that date back to the 12th century and features a series of medieval additions, mainly in the early English Gothic style. The Domesday Book notes there was a church in Somerby, but this antedates that document. Nonetheless, this is the oldest building in the village. Its oldest surviving part is its Norman arch, which dates to 1140. The south aisle was added in 1250, and the font dates from around the same time. Constructed from the local limestone in rubble form, the building includes a nave, a south aisle, a chancel, a porch, a vestry, and a tower. The tower was rebuilt in the 18th century, followed by a full Victorian restoration of the entire church in 1876. Inside, this one houses stained glass windows and war memorial plaques commemorating villagers who died in both World War I and World War II. Among older monuments is a 14th century effigy of a knight and another to Dame Elizabeth Brownlow, who died in 1684. Just up the road we pass the old rectory. This is Grade 2 listed and it's a Queen Anne style building, dating from 1702. It has had a few additions and alterations which came along in the late 18th, the 19th and the 20th centuries. The other Grade 2 listed buildings in the village are a barn at the manor house itself, the stable block at Cold Harbour Farm, and a dwelling called the Old Farmhouse. For such a small village, Old Somerby does quite well with the listed stuff. Opposite the old rectory is Church Cottage, which dates back to the 17th century. This building, like many of the original buildings within High Somerby, is stone built and was originally thatched. Apart from the old farmhouse on Grantham Road, this cottage is probably the oldest surviving house here.
Okay, so even though this is effectively a square that we're walking around the edges of, there are a few little bends in it. There's one of those coming up right now. You can see over there the road bends to the right, it then bends back to the left and heads towards the main road. Now on this corner there's an old school. That's the next thing to pass, and then we're heading towards the site of a former quarry. Working our way towards Low Somerby now, the next thing on our list is the old school, built in 1845 between the two original settlements. It was built using public money on land owned by the church. 1866 school records show that some 42 pupils were in attendance here. Some redevelopment of the building took place in 1962, including the provision of indoor toilets. It remained in use as a school until finally closing due to the lack of pupil numbers on the 16th of July 1971. It's now a private house, and a mighty fine one at that. Towards the end of School Lane now, we're starting to come into Low Somerby, which developed around Grantham Road. Where the two roads meet each other, there used to be a small quarry. You'd never know that these days, because these new houses are all built on its site. It was a stone quarry, and most of what was extracted from the ground here was used for local building and for road repair. It certainly explains the makeup of the buildings we've seen so far. Now completely worked out, it lay abandoned for a while before these houses came along. Next to the old quarry on Grantham Road, you'll see this house. This was a small Methodist chapel that was built in around 1899. Originally, it was constructed using corrugated iron and was in use as a chapel for just 25 years before being sold as a house. Its somewhat crude construction served that purpose well until it was replaced with the present slightly enlarged brick dwelling in 1965. Now you'd barely know this was a chapel given all the extensions and add-ons, but the house does retain the old chapel name. Okay, from the old chapel to something else that's no longer in use for its original purpose. That would be the post office, which you can see right there. It might not be a post office anymore, but it is still lived in. Also situated on Grantham Road is the old forge, which is now Post Office Cottage, and the old post office itself, which served the village for just over 50 years from the 1920s onwards.
Both the post office and the forge were owned and lived in by the Ayres family between 1841 and 1979. We don't seem to have come across many pubs this week. Perhaps that's because all of these villages are too small to sustain them, generally speaking. Old Somerby, though, does have a boozer, and it's usually very much open for business to anyone, not just the Somerbarians. Well, at least that was the case here at the Fox and Hounds until late last year. It's been a rollercoaster ride for this since it started trading, having been closed several times throughout its history. In fact, it had to close, albeit on a temporary basis, a few weeks ago. That was whilst the owners found someone to run it. At the time of writing, this was still the case and everyone was still in the dark about it all. The nearest alternative pub is the Green Man in Ropsley, but the locals would, of course, rather use this. The Fox and Hounds' history goes back a long way. Its current site was previously a farm because originally the pub was within one of the stone cottages at number 3 Grantham Road. That was known as the Plough when it served its last pint and closed its doors. Next to the pub is another property called the Old Farmhouse. It dates from 1644 and it's a Grade 2 listed building. You can see why it's worthy of that status. Reputedly, this attractive old building has the longest internal unsupported beam in Lincolnshire.
The sun is really bright at the moment. That's the only problem when there's no clouds in the sky. The sun gets in my eyes. I should have brought my sunglasses. Anyway, we're about to turn left now onto the pastures. So we're hitting the sort of third side of the square, if you like. And on the corner, there's another notable house. This one right here. Let's see what this is all about, shall we? Now we've reached the pastures, which is the fourth side of Old Somerby's square shape, although it's mostly undeveloped. There is one house that should be noted here, and that's this, on the corner. This is known as the White House, or the White House Farmhouse. It was built in 1876 by its first owner, one Christopher Turner, he of the same family that we discussed back at Stoke Rochford. Living in it was a farmer by the name of Mr. Sneath at first, before in 1916 being taken over by the Jenkinson family. Getting back to High Somerby from here is pretty easy. There are two rights of way that cross the middle of the village. It's basically farmland, but these provide a handy shortcut across the fields. I'll see you back at the start in a moment. And that path that we've just walked on brings you back into the village, right next to the parish notice board. You know what that means? Time for one of these cards. And that, my friends, is Old Somerby pretty much complete. Apart from one thing, we need to get in the car now and drive out to a hamlet called Cold Harbour. And if you're learning to drive, you may very well know this place.
To finish this one off, we need a drive to the north through the small hamlet of Cold Harbour. This is just within the boundaries of Old Somerby and stands on High Dyke, which follows the route of the Roman Ermine Street. Cold Harbour marks the point where High Dyke meets the A52 between Grantham and Donington. There isn't a lot in it, but it used to have a pub many moons ago. There's a house here called Blue Harbour, which used to be the establishment in question. The other notable building here is the stable block of Cold Harbour Farm, which is Grade 2 listed and dates from the mid-18th century. That's really it, aside from one thing that's far more modern: Grantham's Driving Test Centre. Now, how many of you are familiar with this? And with that, we are done with another village and parish in South Kesteven. We have 44 to go. Next week, we'll be back here again to take on another 5, albeit this time much closer to Stamford than Grantham. In the next episode, we've got an ancient castle mound to have a look at. Now, just before I go, remember, this video is part of a huge project to visit every civil parish in England. That's more than 10,000. These routes are pre-planned, and due to time constraints, I can't cover every detail or walk down every street. Please don't complain if this video missed something out. I pronounce names how I choose to. I am very aware that local dialect may vary, and I don't take kindly to criticism about this. You've been warned. It's impossible to know everything too. If this video was terrible, make your own. If you're a regular watcher of The Village Idiot, you're not the only one. If you've got a small business, why not use my videos to advertise it? Leave a comment below if you're interested. And finally, thanks for watching this episode, everybody. Give us a like and a subscribe if you've enjoyed this episode, and share it with your friends and relatives. It all helps to keep this mission going. Until next time, I've been Andy, also known as The Village Idiot, and I'm out.